Hello again, my name's Kehoe and I'm the chairman of UKIP in Erewash constituency, and I've been doing a series of talks on the manifesto, explaining the items one by one. Today I want to return to the subject of crime and policing, but I want to look very narrowly at one particular thing, and that's knife crime and stop and search. Now, in the things I'm going to say today, these are my personal opinions, they're not part of the manifesto. And they're not therefore, I'm not speaking on behalf of UKIP, I'm speaking on behalf of myself. But these are things which I think ought to be in the manifesto, and I hope they'll be considered. Now, the subject of knife crime, you'll be well aware, has been in the news all the time, for a long time now, for months and months. We've been hearing about it almost daily, stabbings all the time, in London and elsewhere. And what I want to talk about is this concept of stop and search and the connection that that has to knife crime, because we've been hearing about other things. We've been hearing about police numbers and so forth, with Mrs. May saying that the number of police officers doesn't have an impact on knife crime, even though she's reduced police personnel numbers by 20,000. She says that doesn't have any impact on knife crime. Well, that's plainly nonsense. But I want to talk today about something much more specific, and it's the powers that constables have to stop and search people. And I want to talk about why those powers are not used, and also how those powers have been curtailed since my day. I served in the 1980s, and back then we used to use stop and search powers very freely and easily and confidently and regularly, and we didn't have any qualms about doing so. We would basically stop whoever we wanted to stop, whenever we wanted to stop them. And we didn't have to fill in paperwork, we didn't have to explain ourselves, we didn't have to justify ourselves, we didn't have to prove why we'd stopped this person or anything like that. But today, it's not like that. And it's a complicated scenario, but ultimately, the point is this, that the real rot set in with the publication of what was known as the Macpherson report, arising out of the Lawrence inquiry. And the findings of this judge, Macpherson, was effectively that the police were institutionally racist in the metropolitan police area. But also it was assumed that that was true everywhere. So all over the country, it began to become assumed that policemen are racist, and therefore that they need to prove that they're not. So they've got to prove a negative effectively. But importantly, anything that they do is seen through this prism of the assumption that they are or might be a racist, and that they are or might be operating from racist motives. Now, let's come back to this thing of stop and search and knife crime. In my day, we used to stop people and search them to see whether they had a knife or a weapon, and it worked perfectly well. We weren't racist in the slightest. We just used to stop the people that we suspected. And what we used was just an ordinary copper's instinct combined with knowledge of what's happening statistically on the streets and groups that are more likely to carry a knife. For example, we formed the view that it was more likely that a knife would be carried by a young man in the town centre in the night or out during the day in the town centre. You're more likely to have a knife than an elderly lady coming in or out of the library. Now that might stun you that we had that view, but it was just plain common sense. That was basically it. We operated on common sense. That has been done away with. You can't use your common sense now. If you want to stop someone, you're going to have to fill forms in. You're going to have to explain why you stopped them. You have to explain to the person you stopped while you're stopping them, and give them a credible reason for why you've chosen this particular person. And woe betide you if you say anything about his age or his ethnicity or anything like that as having anything to do with why you stopped him. But the point is that the facts demonstrate that an overwhelming majority of those who commit knife crimes are young men. Moreover, to be even more controversial, a very high percentage of them are young black men, and furthermore, an extremely high percentage of those people who are stabbed are young black men. Now, this is something which the BBC and police forces don't like to talk about. And if you're a constable and you're having to do the job, you have to basically do the job with your hands tied behind your back. You can't carry out a stop and a search because you know that you can't write down any reason why you're stopping this man other than I have an instinct. I don't like him. I suspect him. I don't like the look of him. I don't like the feel of him. I don't like the sound of him. I was just watching him, the way he was operating and talking and acting. I didn't get a good feel about him. I want to search him. Now you try writing that down on a piece of paper and putting that into your inspector or superintendent and see what happens to your career. Instant career death. The only way that you can justify searching people is by what they call intelligence-led policing. Now what they mean by that effectively is that you need to know before you search someone that they more or less have a knife, or that you've heard that they've got a knife. Now how on earth are you going to hear that? That's something that you might hear. I don't deny it. You might hear that now and again. But that would require a member of the public to come forward and tell you that so-and-so has a knife or is known to carry a knife. Now, what makes you think they're going to say that? You're going to then what? Write his name down on a piece of paper to justify the search. And what if the defence afterwards want to know why you stopped their client? And you then have to reveal the name of the person. And if you won't reveal the name of the person, perhaps that's not going to get through at a prosecution. And if you do reveal the name of the person, they're done for. So therefore, people are not going to come forward and say, I believe that so-and-so is carrying a knife, I think you ought to search him. It's just not going to happen. So it really gets my goat when I keep hearing this on the radio, where you have these liberals and human rights lawyers and academics coming on, speaking of how the police need to operate with intelligence-led policing, not stopping and searching in a widespread way, but just intelligence-led. And that phrase is used, but it's a ridiculous, nonsensical phrase. And anyone who's actually done the job realizes that intelligence-led policing is a non-starter. You don't operate that way. A more correct way to look at it is instinct-led, experience-led policing. That's what it should be. But you can't write that down on a piece of paper. And therefore, what do officers do? They don't want to lose their careers. They know that if they're accused of racism, it's instant career death. So what would you do if you were a constable? Effectively, you don't stop and search anybody. And that's what's been happening. As a consequence of that, young men, and in particular young black men, know perfectly well that the chances of them being stopped and searched are at or about zero. For that reason, they routinely, many of them, many of them, routinely carry knives. That means certain individuals will carry knives most of the time. And the only way to stop them, the only way to catch them, is to have random searching on a regular basis, where they know that there's a high probability that they will be stopped and they will be searched. If they know that, they won't carry knives. If they know the opposite, then they will. And I was just listening today, it got my blood pressure up. I was listening to The World at 1 on Radio 4, and there was this weakling of a police and crime commissioner on, and he was speaking, and he was saying how in Birmingham they'd carried out a few hundred searches and they found 80 knives, 80 knives. And this academic or social worker or whatever she was that was objecting to this was saying that the finding of 80 knives did not justify carrying out that number of searches, 300 or 400 searches. And I thought, what on earth is she talking about? What she was effectively saying was that you should not search someone to find a knife on them unless you know they've got a knife on them. But how on earth are you going to know whether they've got a knife on them unless you search them to find that out? And so the whole thing is so ridiculous, but the police are so scared of being called racists that they will not do their job. Now what I want to propose, and I think UKIP should put this forward, is that we effectively reverse the ethos and the assumptions that were brought into effect by the Macpherson report about 20 years ago. And I'd like to say this: let's make it our default setting that every police officer is not a racist unless and until he does something which creates some kind of substantive reason for thinking that he is one. In which case, then, investigate him, throw the book at him, of course. But until you have that, just assume that he's not. Let him do his job. If he stops a white man, a black man, an Asian man, just assume that he did it for a good reason. Let's all assume that. In legal terms, this is called a rebuttable presumption. It means that you presume there isn't racism until it is shown that there is, rather than what we have at the moment, which is a rebuttable presumption of racism, unless and until you can prove that there isn't. But proving a negative is a very hard thing, and the only way that police can make sure they don't get into trouble for not being a racist is by not doing anything. So that's why they're stopping your cars on the basis of speeding and other things like that, rather than knife crime, because they know they won't get into trouble for that. Anyway, I am going to come back again to the subject of policing to look more at what the manifesto has to say, but I felt it right to bring in this extra point because it's so in the news at the moment. I think it's appropriate. So if you like this and you want to support it, please click on like and also comment and share. It really helps, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next talk.